All right. My name is Ann Cannon, Curator of American Art here at Fenimore Art Museum. And I just want to first say thank you all for taking time out of your afternoon to join me on this tour. I hope you find it entertaining, enlightening, educational. You decide. Before we begin, I'm just going to turn off my camera so I'm not distracting anybody from the art we're about to see. And without further ado, we're going to just jump right in. So the American Masterworks initiative was a collections endeavor that we embarked on in 2023 that brought us, the museum, 27 works of art by some of the biggest names in American art. The entire endeavor was generously funded by the Thaw Charitable Trust, which we are forever grateful for. It's an incredible opportunity that we were given to be able to expand our collection and diversify what we are able to tell as far as the stories within American art. Um, this entire initiative basically came about as we were thinking about how we could expand upon the works that were originally given to the museum by Stephen Carlton Clark in the 1950s to allow, as I mentioned, the museum to tell a more complete story of American art spanning, the Civil War era up until the Great Depression. So this is the a slide that just shows the breadth of the collection and what we were able to acquire for the museum. All of these are and will be on view, except for the few works on paper when we reopen April 1st. So today I'll be walking you all through some of the highlights of the collection with some of my personal favorites, as well as discussing a little bit of, what a curator is thinking about, what a museum is thinking about when it comes to making these types of additions and acquisitions to a museum collection. So a little behind the scenes. So as we began to compile our list, once we had talked to the trust about what we were embarking on, there were some names that popped into our brains as far as, what made the most sense to start with for Fenimore. Um, and that included, the few remaining Hudson River School artists that we didn't have already within our collection. If you've been to the museum before, if you're familiar with Fenimore, you know that we have strong holdings within the Hudson River School artists. We have Thomas Cole represented and Asher B. Durand. But there were a couple that we had never been able to bring into the collection just because they either never come on the market or they're just so rare and sought after. One of those artists was Frederick Church, and I'm really happy to be able to share that Fenimore now has its own Frederick Church. I used to give the Cooper Cole and the Hudson River School tours when I first started at the museum, and the one question I was always asked was, do you guys have a Frederick Church painting? Which I always had to say, no, you have to go to Alana to see those. Church is home. But now we're able to say that we have one. Yay! So this is Church's South American landscape, circa 1856. He was one of the greatest American artists of the 19th century, a pupil of the celebrated American landscape painter Thomas Cole. Church in 1853 embarked on an expedition to South America, where he stayed predominantly in Ecuador and Colombia. During this trip, he executed drawings and oil sketches of mountains, trees, and plants. Small scale, he was doing this all in a tiny little journal or notebook, so he could easily travel with it. And he would later make use of these works um, while he was creating these large scale compositions that were produced in his studio. This is a moderate sized church. Not unfortunately, but our gallery spaces wouldn't be able to accommodate one of his monumental pieces. If you've ever been to the Met and you've walked through their American wing, you've probably seen the massive churches that are just an entire wall. This is a good Fenimore sized church, but it still has all of that detail and depth that you want within a church painting. You feel like you could, wade into that river, into that scene when you look at it. Church painted this in his New York studio 2 years after he returned from Ecuador. And it's a really interesting imaginary synthesis of all of these different motifs that he had previously recorded in all of these drawings and oil sketches, including this distant view of the mountain in the um, background here, and this boat within this river in the midground. And what's really interesting is recently we were able to identify through the boat that it's most likely more so a scene of Colombia than it is Ecuador because of that specific boat, which is only used or only was used on a very specific river, the Magdalena River in Colombia. And just a little fun fact there. Some of my favorite details in this painting include, the people lounging on top of the boat, as well as if we look very closely in the tree, you can see all of these little fruit bats that are just kind of perched upside down, which is just a really fun little detail. So Church's work in South America, kind of, and this work in particular, got us thinking about expanding, showing, we have a lot of holdings within the collection that talk about Americans in Europe, but we really didn't have anything that showcased, aside from now this painting, South America. So that got us thinking about Martin Johnson Head. This is Catalea orchid with two Brazilian hummingbirds from 1871. And Head was actually inspired by Frederick Church, as well as John James Audubon and his bird studies, and all of the other Hudson River School artists to venture down to Brazil and Colombia and Panama, Nicaragua, and Jamaica, all of these areas, to look specifically at the flora and the fauna, and more specifically at the birds, because these types of hummingbirds and these types of flowers were not things that you could easily see in the United States at the time, especially in the Northeast in the 1870s. So this is a really interesting and kind of pivotal work within Head's repertoire. Before 1870, he was only focusing on hummingbirds in his paintings. And after 1870, he decided he was also going to, incorporate the flora, these orchids in particular, because they were just so vibrant and he'd never seen anything like them. This painting from 1871 is one of the first where he's combining the orchid and the hummingbird. And this motif kind of went on to become what he was known for in art history. And it's just this fantastic composition. You get close to it and you can just see all of the minute details in the lichen growing, the different foliage here, the colors, the depth. It's this great, almost miniature, but monumental at the same time, still life of these birds and this orchid. And it's incredible. It's done on a panel, which makes me think that he probably did this while he was still in South America. Panels were easier to travel with as opposed to canvases, which, are a little floppier. So it's just all of these little details within a work of art when you just, as a curator, you look at it and you just know that it is the right call, the right pick for your collection. Right. Staying within the Hudson River School, because why not? Fenimore has an incredible collection of Native American art. But what's interesting is that we didn't have many paintings in the fine art collection that depicted the American West. And that's where Albert Bierstadt kind of came into the discussion. We were lucky enough to acquire two works by the artist, and these are two really interesting works when you have them side by side, because you've got on the left a quintessential Bierstadt landscape, and then on the right, a slightly unique landscape, something that you might not have immediately associated with Bierstadt. You don't see a lot of Bierstadt seascapes. We're going to start talking about the one on the left, and then we'll move over to the Golden Gate. So Bierstadt first studied Mount Hood in 1863 during his second Western journey. He was so enamored by the area and the landscape that he repeatedly returned to the subject and actually did one of his monumental paintings that's now owned by the Portland Museum of Art in Oregon of the same scene. In our painting, Bierstadt is showing Mount Hood beyond the winding Columbia River. And we can see that Mount Hood is kind of reaching up into these drifting clouds, and the way that he's playing with the sunlight here, illuminating the snow on the side of the mountain and the calm water glistening beneath. He's placed boats in his composition, which is really interesting, as well as this one solitary frolicking deer I like to call these just they're Bierstadt deer. Any Bierstadt landscape, there's always at least one deer just kind of frolicking. And one of the games that I like to play when I go to museums is spot the Bierstadt without looking at the label. You can typically find it through the deer. You should try it the next time you go to a museum. Anyway, the combination of the boat and the deer here has this really interesting discussion of man and nature, man versus nature, and this balance that places his viewer on the precipice of the American history during the early settlement of the West. So you're kind of on the frontier here. He's giving you that feeling. While Mount Hood is placed in the background of this picture, its dominant presence is underscores, the ongoing fascination that it struck with the painter. On the other side of the slide here, we have the Golden Gate from 1872 about, and this was originally sketched during Bierstadt's time in San Francisco. But it was actually created in his studio in Waterville, New York. Bierstadt's return to New York was reported by the Bulletin of October 27th, 1873, which noted that, quote, the artist would work many of his Pacific Coast sketches into pictures, end quote. It's this really, again, a poignant reminder of Bierstadt's unmatched ability, setting the tone for pictures that represent the toils of man against imposing nature and the transient beauty of a moment. So here he's captured this kind of man versus nature setting in which we have these three fishermen trying desperately to bring their boat to shore before they're kind of hit by this massive wave that's barreling towards them. And it may or may not, I think some sources believe that this is a nocturne. I'm not totally convinced it's a nocturne, but I'll leave that up to everybody's own interpretation. There's a slight darkening of the sky, but it doesn't quite read as nocturnal to me. All right, so those are the landscapes that we were able to bring into the collection. The other area that we were thinking about was portraiture. Fenimore has a massive collection of American folk art and American folk portraiture, but we really didn't have anything within our collection that discussed the American Gilded Age and those monumental portraits that are associated with it. And that brought us to, oh, excuse me, there was one more landscape. This is a later landscape, apologies for that, by Thomas Moran from 1918. He was also inspired by Bierstadt to go west. And he and Bierstadt actually were some of the big names that helped to establish the national parks within the United States, especially out west. Yellowstone, for example, their paintings were used to help kind of bring people and tourism out west. So this is another great landscape depicting the West. Back to portraiture. So as we were talking about portraiture, one of the names that came into our brains was William Merritt Chase. This is a portrait entitled The Lady in White from 1894. And it's a monumental, full-scale Gilded Age portrait. And it depicts his wife, Alice. He painted her numerous times during their marriage. And though Alice was the model for this painting, Chase didn't intend it to be perceived as a portrait, but rather a study of a white satin dress. He was trained at the Royal Academy in Munich and was a master practitioner of what is known as bravura brushwork, which means that he rarely did preparatory drawings or paintings for his major works. And he would go about creating paintings like this by taking his brush that would be heavily loaded with paint and just directly applying it to his canvas. There was no underdrawing, no preparatory sketch. It was just immediate, oil paint to canvas application with this very unerring ability. And when you look closely at this painting, you can see how he's able to capture with just a few strokes of his brush here the satin and the way that it kind of falls and wrinkles here, and the way that he's able to also capture this very soft, feathery fan that Alice is holding in her other hand. One of my favorite details of this painting is if you look very closely at her hand here, you can see that he has almost at the last minute added in her wedding ring, just in case somebody were to get the wrong idea about her availability. I like to imagine that he stood back from the painting after he finished it and went, oh no, I made her look too pretty. I better make sure everybody knows she's taken. So you can, when you look at the way that he's painted the ring, it almost looks like he's taken the back end of his brush and dipped it in that paint and just kind of poked just so to get the right glint to immediately draw any potential male suitor's eyes to the fact that she is taken. So Sargent is another name that came into our brains when we were thinking about portraiture and American portraiture and the masters of American portraiture. This is his portrait of Lawrence Millet from 1887. And before Sargent actually painted this portrait, he was in Paris and created a huge controversy at the Salon of 1884 with his provocative portrait of Madame X, which is owned by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Paris was so scandalized by the portrait that Sargent actually fled France to England and the artist colony of Broadway, which was a quiet Cotswold village frequented by wealthy artistic Americans. There, Sargent was able to stay with his friend Francis Frank Millet and embarked on a very important period of artistic experimentation and stylistic transition. Lawrence's father, Frank, was also an artist who would paint with Sargent at Broadway. And what's interesting about this painting, number one, is that it was uncommissioned, which means that Sargent didn't have a patron breathing down his neck while he was painting it. He just chose to paint it at his leisure. And that allowed him a lot more freedom and liberties when it came to how he wanted it to be, the final state, so to speak. He didn't have somebody saying, like, no, I need you to, tighten up your brushwork here or make that background look more finished. He was able to kind of step back when he was ready and say, this is done. So we can see here that the painting is very loose and it's more relaxed with very visible brushwork. You see that Lawrence's curls are all basically just single strokes of the brush, which I think is fabulous. You know that you're a good painter when you're able to depict curls with just a little flick of the wrist like that. So this demonstrated Sargent's break from salon-style studio paintings, which were much tighter. There wasn't as visible brushwork that was kind of frowned upon at the Paris salons. So here he is able to kind of express himself and play around with all of these new techniques and methods. And what's fun about this painting is along the top of the canvas, it's actually inscribed, showing that it was a gift from Sargent to Lawrence's mother, Lily. It says, to Lily with love, John Singer Sargent. And that really speaks to the intimacy and affection he held for the Millet family. And I just love how innocent and youthful little Lawrence looks in his sailor suit, holding his foot like that. He was 3 years old when this was painted. So imagine having a 3-year-old posing for you and trying to get him to sit still. It's just mind-boggling to me. Sticking to the theme of American artists abroad, we're going to look at these two works by Childe Hassam. Hassam is one of the big names when it comes to American Impressionism, not to be confused with French Impressionism. And by 1896, so around the time that the painting on the left, Mrs. Hassam in the Garden, was created, Hassam had begun to attain artistic maturity and success. As noted by a critic from the New York Times, quote, few of our native painters have succeeded in so many directions. Sea, landscape, architecture, flowers, still life, animals, and figures. He seems to be able to paint anything his fancy dictates. He can be as finished, as broad, as impressionist, as colorful as the best of them, and all at will, end quote. High praise. The origin of Hassam's light color palette and interest in the theme of women and flowers coincided with an extended stay in France beginning in 1886. While there, he was studying and adopting aspects of the French Impressionist techniques and their choice of subject matter, molding them to suit his own aesthetic objectives. He stayed in France for 3 years, observing the Impressionists working around him. And it was on this trip that he first depicted the neo-Gothic church of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois, which we also see in the painting on the right, near the picturesque banks of the Seine. Hassam returned to Paris once more in 1897 when our painting was done here on the right, when And like the French Impressionists he admired, he selected this very everyday subject and likely painted this scene en plein air, which meant that he was directly on site, his easel set up on the sidewalk across the street from this scene. I really enjoy these two paintings, and the reason we decided to go for two Hassams is because they both showcase a different technique, and they're so different from one another. When you look at both of these, when you look at Mrs. Hassam to start, they're just a year apart. Number one, 1896, 1897. Mrs. Hassam in the garden has the much more polished, finished look to her. There's no areas of visible canvas peeking out, and the paint buildup when you see it in person is much thicker, which indicates that he probably did this in his studio and was going back to it repeatedly. Whereas when we look at Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois on the right, we can see that it's much sketchier, which indicates that he was painting it on site. All of these little areas of gray that we see in the sky here and even in the church spire are exposed canvas, showcasing how quickly he was in fact painting. The most finished aspect and area of the composition really is this area where we see the fencing and the trees and the individual people. And I just love the cross section of people that he has depicted as well. We've got the street sweeper front and center, two businessmen walking while reading the paper, a kind of depressed looking police officer, and then kind of turning the corner, we have a nun walking away from the church. So it's just this great commentary on Parisian society at the time. Sticking within American Impressionism and Impressionism in general, um, of course, when we're talking about big names in American art, you can't not bring up Mary Cassatt. She's probably, well, she is 100% one of my favorite artists. So much so that we're going to be having an exhibit of her work this summer. So that's going to be really exciting, featuring our painting here. But she's also just such an incredible figure to study and observe and learn about the way that she held herself. So this is her Madame de Fleury and her child, painted between 1890 and 1891. And it's a remarkably contemporary reimagining of this very timeless subject of a mother and child. The period in which this was painted, the 1890s, has been regarded as the peak of Cassatt's artistic career. And it is a really intimate look into, the psyche of a mother and child. And what's really cool about this painting is that these were people that she knew. This was a woman that she called a friend, which is rare for Cassatt. She typically would use models to have that level of detachment from her subjects, but here she's painted Marie de Fleury, who was a friend within her artistic circle, and her daughter, Marie Sophie. The sitter, Marie, was the sister-in-law of the sculptor Paul Albert Bartholomé and shared a very close friendship with both Cassatt and Edgar Degas. And it's just such a great intimate moment. You can't tell, has Marie Sophie been fussing and that's why her cheeks are so ruddy? Um, is Marie just totally exhausted, or is she just kind of zoning out because she's comfortable around her friend? And what I also love about this painting is how it's slightly unfinished. So if we look at the table here that she's resting her elbow on, it just kind of dissolves into unfinished canvas. And then when you look over at her hand, kind of holding her child to her lap, we can see Cassatt's process and how she would apply first lines in darker blue and then come back in with her colors to really flesh out her subjects. It's just, oh, it's just such a great painting. Okay, so we're going to venture back to America and talk about Robert Henri and the Ashcan School. American art in the early 20th century goes in a lot of different directions stylistically. Henri is a good bridge between Impressionism and American art of the 20th century because there's elements of, Sargent and Cassatt within his work with the loose brushwork and the fact that it is portraiture. But there's also darker, grittier aspects that kind of help to bring you more into, other movements, including the Ashcan School. So Henri is considered to be an urban realist. And he liked to create these really straightforward, vital likenesses of unusual sitters. But he's best remembered today as the influential, progressive, and charismatic leader of the so called Ashcan school of urban realism. His credo was art for life's sake, and he was noted for his democratic approach to portraiture and choosing sitters from diverse racial groups and walks of life. This painting is a portrait of Batalla Rubino, who was a Spanish dancer distinguished for her striking beauty and unusual dramatic costumes. And she became one of Henri's favorite models. He, during 1909 to 1910, painted multiple portraits of her, which can be found in other museum collections. Someday I would love to do a show where we bring them all together and compare and contrast and kind of break down her life and her relationship with Henri. But that's a project for another day. So I mentioned the Ashcan School, and you're all probably wondering, what is that? So the Ashcan School was this really interesting artistic group that, unlike other schools, there wasn't any connecting style associated with the Ashcan, save for this idea of a darker, grittier palette. Their palette and subject matter are how the group got its name, with critics stating that it looked like someone threw a can of ashes onto the canvases. They captured the daily lives of the working class New Yorkers in a time that was fraught with all of this urbanization and industrialization. So we have Henri, and then we have Ernest Lawson and William Glackens, who were two members of the Ashcan School. And you can really see in this side how there is no stylistic similarity here. It's very different, very diverse. Among the many artists working in New York City in the early 20th century, Ernest Lawson, on the left, importantly captured the city's rapidly changing landscape at the height of industrialization. This is his building the New York subway, which was painted between 1904 and 1909 when the Interborough Rapid Transit was being constructed in his northern Manhattan neighborhood of Washington Heights. And it's a very gritty scene. It does look ashy almost, like it's dirty. Because, we've got all of these laborers working, shoveling, digging. You've got a horse-drawn carriage in the background. You've got all this steam and a crane in the distance, doing all of the nitty-gritty, gross work to make the city better. In contrast, William Glackens and his Washington Square The Green Dress, done about the same time, Glackens had a studio in Washington Square Park where he painted this scene. He shared that studio with Ernest Lawson, which I think is really interesting that they were that close to one another and they had such desperate styles. Here we can see that he's capturing the hustle and bustle of the sun-drenched park. In the distance, we can see hints of the red townhouses that still border the eastern edge of the park. And this tree that he's using here to bisect the composition also appears in other paintings that he did of the park, which I think is really interesting as well. It's a very bold stylistic choice to have something kind of just like splitting your composition like that. But then perhaps he's using it to make some sort of commentary between, the older women on the right and the younger girls on the left. All to be revealed. So yeah, that's the Ashcan School in a nutshell. To finish the tour, I just wanted to say I saved the best for last, and probably the biggest wow that we were able to bring into the collection, and something that I think none of us working at Fenimore thought we would ever be able to say that we owned. So this is Georgia O'Keeffe's Brown and Tan Leaves from 1928. Between the years 1918 and 1934, O'Keeffe spent extended summers at Alfred Stieglitz's family estate, located just north of Lake George in upstate New York. She found herself inspired by the area, creating over 200 works representing an abstract and modernist take on panoramic views of the lake, mountains, close-ups of trees, flowers, and barns, as well as intimate yet monumental studies of leaves. O'Keeffe often collected leaves that appealed to her for their striking diversity of shape and color, and she actually created 29 leaf paintings between 1922 and 1931, all based on leaves she found and collected while at Lake George. O'Keeffe it might not at first make sense why Fenimore would have acquired an O'Keeffe painting, but there actually is a connection between O'Keeffe and Eugene Thaw. He was the executor of her estate and was very influential and helpful when they were creating the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum out west. So it was a poignant kind of ending point for us to kind of figure out our date range and to be able to bring New York O'Keeffe back to New York. Um, so to conclude the tour, I'm just going to end with a quote from O'Keeffe that she wrote in 1922. Quote, "Nothing is less real than realism. Details are confusing. It is only by selection, by elimination, by emphasis that we get at the real meaning of things." End quote.